I never believed the stories about the shelter until my third night on shift. The wind was howling outside, rattling the old windows, and the generator's hum barely covered the sounds coming from the kennels. I'd worked with animals for years, rescued strays, bottle-fed kittens, even volunteered at city pounds, but nothing prepared me for the noises I heard in the dark at Pine Hollow Animal Sanctuary. It started as a low, guttural growl, too deep for any dog I'd ever met. Then a chorus of yips and whines, but warped, like someone was playing a recording backward. I froze in the hallway, flashlight trembling in my hand, as something heavy scraped against the metal bars at the far end of the kennel row. The other staff had warned me not to check the cages after midnight, no matter what I heard. But when you hear what sounds like a child crying or a dog begging for help in a voice that almost sounds human, it's hard not to break the rules. That's the first lesson you learn here. The animals have rules for the staff, not the other way around. And if you ever find yourself volunteering at a remote shelter like this, remember, don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Don't answer the calls from the dark. And above all, never, ever break the rules. Because if you do, you might not make it out. I almost didn't. I signed up for the volunteer program at Pine Hollow Animal Sanctuary because I needed a change. After a messy breakup and a string of dead-end jobs in the city, I was desperate for something that felt meaningful. I'd always loved animals. Growing up, my room was a revolving door of foster kittens and injured birds. When I saw the online ad for a live-in volunteer at a remote shelter, it felt like fate. A few weeks of hard work, fresh air, and the unconditional affection of dogs and cats sounded like exactly what I needed to reset my life. The drive out to Pine Hollow took me farther from civilization than I'd ever been. My phone lost signal an hour before I arrived, and the last stretch of road was little more than a gravel path winding through dense pine forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches arching overhead to block out the sun. When I finally saw the battered wooden sign, Pine Hollow Animal Sanctuary, Volunteers Welcome, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The shelter itself was a cluster of low, weathered buildings surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. A faded barn sat at the edge of the property, and behind it, the forest stretched on for miles. As I stepped out of my car, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no distant traffic, just the wind sighing through the trees and the faint metallic clatter of kennel doors. A sharp, musky odor hung in the air, stronger than any animal shelter I'd visited before. It wasn't just the usual mix of fur and disinfectant. There was something else, something wild and sour, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I caught a glimpse of movement behind the fence, a flash of fur, a pair of eyes reflecting the afternoon light, gone before I could focus. A woman in a faded green jacket approached, her smile tight and her eyes wary. "You must be the new volunteer," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something to appear. "I'm Marlene, the manager. Let's get you settled in." As we walked toward the main building, I noticed the other staff moving quickly, heads down, avoiding the kennels. The animals inside watched us with unsettling intensity, their eyes following every step. I told myself it was just nerves, just the strangeness of a new place. But even then, I felt the first prickling sense that Pine Hollow was nothing like I'd expected. Marlene led me through a narrow hallway lined with faded animal posters and a bulletin board crowded with handwritten notes. The shelter's main office was cramped, its desk buried under stacks of intake forms and supply lists. Two other staff members were already inside, a wiry man in his 30s with a mop of curly hair and a younger woman with tired eyes and a nervous smile. "This is Greg, our night supervisor, and that's Tasha. She handles the morning rounds," Marlene introduced. Greg nodded, barely glancing up from the clipboard in his hands. Tasha offered a quick wave, her fingers fidgeting with the zipper of her jacket. "Glad to have you here," Tasha said, but her voice was thin, and she kept glancing at the clock on the wall. It was only 3 p.m., but I sensed a tension in the room, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Marlene handed me a battered staff badge and a laminated schedule.
"We run a tight ship here. Shifts are strictly timed, no one stays late, and we always hand off in person. You'll shadow Greg tonight, then start your own shifts tomorrow." Greg finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wary. "Don't wander off alone, especially after dark. If you need anything, radio first. And always check the logbook before you start your rounds." I nodded, a little surprised by the formality. In other shelters, routines were important, but this felt different, more like a set of rituals than simple procedures. I noticed a whiteboard behind the desk, covered in rules written in red marker. No feeding after midnight, no matter how much they beg. Never open Kennel 7. Lights out by 11:30. Log all animal noises. Tasha caught me reading and quickly stepped in front of the board, forcing a smile. "It's just... things run smoother when we stick to the rules. The animals get upset if we don't." Greg and Marlene exchanged a look I couldn't quite read, part warning, part resignation. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the stress of a busy shelter. But as I followed Greg out to the kennels, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of place needed so many rules, and why everyone seemed so afraid to break them. After a quick tour of the shelter's cramped living quarters and a rundown of the daily chores, Marlene led me into her office. The room was small and cluttered, with stacks of paperwork, faded animal photos, and a battered coffee maker that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. She motioned for me to sit, then closed the door behind us with a soft click. "Before you start your first shift, there's something we need to go over," she said, her voice low. She opened a drawer and pulled out a laminated sheet, sliding it across the desk toward me. At the top, in bold red letters, it read, "Rules for Staff, Pine Hollow Animal Sanctuary." I picked it up, expecting the usual reminders about hand washing and emergency exits. Instead, my eyes landed on the first rule: never feed the animals after midnight, no matter how much they beg. I looked up, half smiling. "Is this a joke?" Marlene's expression didn't change. "It's not a joke. Every rule on that list is there for a reason. If you want to make it through your time here, you'll follow them. No exceptions." I glanced back at the sheet.
2. If you hear scratching at your door between 1 and 3 a.m., do not open it. Ignore any voices, even if they sound familiar. A chill crept up my spine. "What happens if—" She cut me off. "Don't. Just don't. Trust me, it's better not to know." I read on. "The black cat in Kennel 7 is not up for adoption. Do not move her. Do not open her cage, and do not speak to her. If any animal escapes its enclosure after dark, do not attempt to retrieve it. Notify a supervisor and stay inside. During storms, cover all mirrors and reflective surfaces. If you find a collar or tag that you don't recognize, leave it where you found it. Do not touch it. 7. At sunset, make sure all animals are accounted for. If you count more animals than we have on record, lock yourself in the staff room and wait until sunrise." I tried to laugh, but the sound died in my throat. This is a lot. Are you serious? Marlene leaned forward, her eyes tired but intense. I know how it sounds. I thought it was hazing when I started too. But I've seen what happens when people get careless. We lost a volunteer last year. She broke Rule 2. We never found her, but sometimes, late at night, we still hear her voice outside the staff quarters. I stared at the list, the words blurring as my mind raced. So, what? Animals are dangerous? She hesitated. Some of them, yes. But it's not just them. This place, it's old. The land remembers things. The rules keep us safe. And they keep the animals safe too. I nodded slowly, not sure if I believed her, but unwilling to argue. Okay, I'll follow the rules. Marlene's shoulders relaxed a fraction. Good. You must follow these, no matter what. Even if it feels wrong. Even if you're scared. The rules are the only thing standing between you and what's out there. As I left her office, the laminated sheet felt heavier in my hands than it should have. I told myself it was just a weird tradition, a way to spook the new volunteer. But deep down, I wondered what kind of place needed rules like these, and what would happen if I broke them. My first overnight shift started quietly enough. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the shelter was swallowed by a heavy, unnatural darkness. I made my rounds, double-checking that every kennel was locked and each animal had fresh water. The rules sheet was folded in my back pocket, its edges already soft from nervous handling.
At first, the animals seemed calm. The dogs curled up in their beds. The cats watched me with lazy, half-lidded eyes. I tried to convince myself that Marlene's warnings were just a way to keep us vigilant. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thick and still, and the usual animal smells were overpowered by something sharp and metallic, like ozone before a storm. It started with the dogs. One by one, they lifted their heads and stared at the far end of the kennel row, ears pricked, bodies tense. Their hackles rose in perfect unison, and a low, synchronized growl rumbled through the building. I shivered, telling myself it was just a stray raccoon or a fox outside. But when I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam seemed to bend, swallowed by the shadows. Then came the noises, not the usual barks or yowls, but something else. Soft scratching, like claws on wood, coming from the staff hallway. I remembered Rule 2. If you hear scratching at your door between 1 and 3 a.m., do not open it. Ignore any voices, even if they sound familiar. My heart pounded as the scratching grew louder, then stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, muffled whimper that sounded almost human. I gripped the edge of the desk, fighting the urge to check the hallway. "It's just the wind," I whispered. But the words felt hollow. I busied myself with paperwork, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on my back. Every so often, I'd glance up to find the black cat in Kennel 7, watching me, her yellow eyes unblinking, tail flicking in slow, deliberate arcs. Around 2 a.m., a soft, pitiful mewling echoed from the far end of the cat room. It sounded like a kitten in pain, desperate and alone. My instincts screamed at me to help, to break the rule and comfort the animal. I took a step toward the sound, then stopped, remembering Marlene's warning. No matter how much they beg. I forced myself to sit back down, hands trembling.
The mewling continued for several minutes, growing weaker, then faded into silence. I stared at the clock, counting the minutes until sunrise. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-heard whispers and shifting shadows. When dawn finally broke, the shelter seemed to exhale, the tension lifting as if nothing had happened. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I left the building, I caught the black cat's gaze one last time. She blinked slowly, almost approvingly, and I wondered if she knew how close I'd come to breaking the rules. The next night, the shelter felt even more claustrophobic. The air was thick with the scent of wet fur and something sour, and the wind outside rattled the windows like impatient fingers. I tried to focus on my tasks, feeding, cleaning, logging notes, but my mind kept drifting back to the rules. Each one seemed more absurd than the last, but the memory of the previous night's noises lingered, making me second-guess every instinct. Around midnight, I was restocking the supply closet when I heard it, a sharp, panicked yelp from the dog kennels. It was followed by frantic scratching, claws raking against metal. I rushed down the hallway, heart pounding, and found myself standing in front of Kennel 4. Inside, Daisy, a gentle old retriever, was pacing in circles, whining and pawing at the door. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she kept glancing toward the far end of the room where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally thick. I knelt down, murmuring soothing words through the bars. "It's okay, girl, you're safe." But she only grew more agitated, her whines rising to a desperate pitch. I remembered the rules. If any animal escapes its enclosure after dark, do not attempt to retrieve it. Notify a supervisor and stay inside. But Daisy wasn't out. She was trapped, terrified, and begging for help.
My hand hovered over the latch. What harm could it do to comfort her? She was old, harmless, and clearly in distress. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Marlene to appear and scold me. The shelter was silent except for Daisy's cries and the distant, rhythmic thumping of something against the back wall. A voice echoed from the far end of the kennels, soft and pleading. "Please, help me." It was a child's voice, thin and wavering, coming from the direction of Kennel 7. My skin prickled. I knew that the kennel was supposed to be empty except for the black cat, who now sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on me. Logic warred with compassion. Every instinct screamed at me to help, to open the door, to check on the child. But the rules pulsed in my mind, each one a warning. Ignore any voices, even if they sound familiar. Was this what Marlene meant? Was this the test? I stood, torn between the urge to help and the fear of what might happen if I did. Daisy's cries grew softer, her body trembling as she pressed herself into the corner of her kennel. The child's voice faded into a low, guttural growl. Then silence. I backed away, heart racing, guilt gnawing at my insides. What if I was wrong? What if the rules were just superstition, and I'd let an animal or a child suffer because of it? But deep down, I knew something was watching, waiting for me to slip. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daisy's terrified face and heard that pleading voice. I wondered how many times the staff had faced the same choice and what had happened to those who gave in. It was my 4th night at Pine Hollow when the rules were broken. The evening started with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The animals were restless, pacing their enclosures and watching the doors with anxious eyes. Marlene was late for her shift, leaving me and Tasha, the other night volunteer, to handle the rounds alone. Tasha was new, only a week ahead of me, and still clung to the idea that the rules were just a quirky tradition.
Around 11:30 p.m., the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain hammered the roof and thunder rattled the windows. The power flickered, then steadied, casting the shelter in a sickly yellow glow. I was in the staff room, double-checking the animal log, when I heard Tasha's voice echo down the hallway. "Sam, can you come here? Something's wrong with Kennel 3. I hurried to the dog wing, my heart pounding. Tasha stood in front of Kennel 3, her face pale. Inside, a small terrier named Max was convulsing, his body twisting in unnatural spasms.
His eyes rolled back and a thick black foam bubbled from his mouth. Tasha's hands shook as she fumbled with the latch. "I think he's choking. We have to help him," she cried. I grabbed her wrist before she could open the door. "Wait, the rules!" But she yanked free, panic overriding caution. "He's dying, Sam. I can't just stand here." She flung the kennel door open and rushed inside. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered again, plunging us into brief, strobing darkness. Max's convulsions stopped abruptly. He lay still for a heartbeat, then slowly rose to his feet. His eyes, once cloudy with pain, were now pitch black, reflecting nothing. He turned his head toward Tasha, who froze, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. "Max?" she whispered. The dog's mouth opened impossibly wide, and a guttural, inhuman voice spilled out. "Thank you." Tasha screamed, stumbling backward, but the thing that had been Max lunged at her, impossibly fast. It latched onto her arm, its jaws stretching, distorting, as if its bones were made of rubber. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I heard Tasha's screams, high and desperate, then a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach twist.
I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the kennel. Max was gone. So was Tasha. The only sign they'd ever been there was a smear of black foam on the floor and a single, bloodied sneaker lying just inside the open kennel. The other animals had gone silent, every eye fixed on me. The black cat in Kennel 7 sat at the front of her cage, tail curled neatly around her paws, watching with an expression that almost looked like satisfaction. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just the storm, the stress, the isolation? But the empty kennel and the lingering, unnatural cold told me otherwise. I ran to the staff room and locked the door, pressing my back against it as if that could keep the darkness out. My hands shook as I dialed Marlene's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice barely more than a whisper. Tasha's gone. Max is gone. I think the rules are real. For the rest of the night, I sat in the staff room, listening to the rain and the occasional distant sound of scratching at the door. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just waited for dawn, praying that the rules would be enough to keep me safe. The morning after Tasha vanished, the shelter felt different. The air was heavy, thick with dread and the metallic tang of fear. I barely slept, and when Marlene arrived, I met her at the door, my face pale and my hands still trembling. She took one look at me and led me straight to her office, locking the door behind us. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice low and urgent. I recounted the night in a rush. Max's transformation, Tasha's disappearance, the black foam, the darkness that seemed to swallow the room. Marlene listened without interrupting, her face growing grimmer with every detail. When I finished, she sighed and pulled a battered file from her desk drawer. "You deserve to know the truth," she said, sliding it across to me. "This place isn't just an animal shelter. It's a barrier, a thin spot between worlds." I stared at her, not sure I'd heard right. "A barrier?" She nodded. "The land here is old. Long before the shelter, before the town, people knew to avoid this place. They called it a crossing ground. Things from the other side, things that don't belong in our world, try to slip through. The animals here, some of them are guardians, some are just unlucky enough to get caught in the crossfire. The rules aren't just for our safety, they're for containment."
She opened the file, revealing faded photographs, animals with eyes that glowed in the dark, strange symbols carved into the shelter's foundation, Newspaper clippings about disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Every so often, something gets through. That's why the rules are so strict. Feeding after midnight, opening doors to voices, touching things that don't belong. These are invitations. They weaken the barrier, let things slip in. I thought of the black cat in Kennel 7, her unblinking stare, the way the other animals seemed to defer to her. What about the cat? Marlene's lips pressed into a thin line. She's been here longer than any of us. Some say she's a guardian, others think she's a warning. All I know is when she's agitated, something bad is coming. I flipped through the file, my mind reeling. So, Tasha? Marlene's eyes were haunted. She broke the rules. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you just disappear. Sometimes something takes your place. That's why we're so careful. That's why we never, ever break the rules. I looked around the office, suddenly noticing the subtle protections, salt lines along the windowsills, mirrors covered with cloth, a small iron bell hanging above the door. How long have you known? Since my first week, Marlene admitted. I didn't believe it either, not until I saw what happened to my predecessor. She tried to help a stray that appeared at the gate after dark. The next morning she was gone, and something else was wearing on her face. A chill ran through me. The shelter, with its peeling paint and chain-link fences, was more than a haven for lost animals. It was a battleground, a last line of defense against things that should not exist. I thought of the rules, the way they'd seemed so arbitrary, even cruel. Now they felt like the only thing standing between us in chaos. What happens if the barrier fails? Marlene's voice was barely a whisper. Then the things on the other side come through, and there won't be enough rules in the world to stop them. I left her office with the file clutched in my hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The shelter was no longer just a place to help animals. It was a prison, a fortress, and I was one of its reluctant wardens. The storm that night was worse than any before. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the walls, and the wind howled so fiercely it sounded like voices screaming through the trees. The animals sensed it too. Every dog barked and whined, the cats hissed and paced, and even the black cat in Kennel 7 was restless, her tail lashing, eyes fixed on the back door. I was in the staff room with Marlene and Greg, the night supervisor, when the power went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly red glow. The air felt charged, heavy with the promise of something terrible.
Then came the sound, a deep, guttural growl, not from any animal I had ever heard, echoing from the far end to the kennels. The dogs fell silent. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof and that impossible growl growing louder, closer. Greg grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door. "I'll check it out," he said. But Marlene caught his arm. "No, we stay together. Remember the rules." But the growling didn't stop. It was joined by scratching, pounding, and then a voice, Tasha's voice, calling from the darkness. "Help me! Please, I'm trapped! Sam, Marlene, please let me in!" My blood ran cold. I knew what I'd seen, what Marlene had told me, but hearing Tasha's voice so familiar, so desperate, made my heart ache. Greg's face twisted with guilt. "We can't just leave her out there!" Marlene's grip tightened. "That's not Tasha. You know it isn't." The pounding grew more violent. The back door rattled on its hinges. The animals in the kennels pressed against the bars, some whimpering, others snarling at the door. The black cat yowled, a sound so piercing it made my teeth ache. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight game shook as I swept it across the room. Shadows twisted and writhed along the walls. The pounding stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, as if something was dragging claws along the metal door. Then, with a deafening crash, the back door burst open. A freezing wind swept in, carrying with it the stench of rot and something older, fouler. In the doorway stood a shape, tall, hunched, its limbs too long, its face a shifting blur. Behind it, more shapes moved, crawling and slithering into the shelter. Greg panicked. He bolted for the exit, ignoring Marlene's shouts. "I'm not dying here!" he screamed, disappearing into the darkness. I heard him fumble with the front door, then a scream, cut off, abrupt. The rules: if any animal escapes its enclosure after dark, do not attempt to retrieve it. Notify a supervisor and stay inside. Greg had broken the rule.
He was gone. Marlene and I backed into the staff room, slamming the door and locking it. The file of rules was still in my hand, my knuckles white. The creatures prowled the halls, their footsteps wet and heavy. The animals in the kennels howled and shrieked, but none tried to escape. They knew better. The black cat appeared at the staff room window, her eyes glowing in the darkness. She stared at me, then at the file in my hand. I remembered the last rule. At sunset, make sure all animals are accounted for. If you count more animals than we have on record, lock yourself in the staff room and wait until sunrise. I counted, heart pounding. There were more animals than there should have been. Shapes in the darkness, eyes gleaming, bodies shifting. The barrier was failing. The rules were all that stood between us and whatever waited beyond. Marlene's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear beneath. We have to wait it out. Don't open the door, no matter what you hear. The creatures prowled outside, whispering in voices that sounded like lost friends, loved ones, even my own. They begged, pleaded, and threatened. My resolve wavered, but I clung to the rules, repeating them like a mantra. Hours passed. The storm raged. The creatures tried every trick, voices, scratching, even mimicking the animals' cries. But we didn't open the door. We didn't move. Finally, as dawn broke, the noises faded, the cold lifted, the emergency lights flickered back on. I opened the door to find the shelter in ruins, kennels torn open, the back door hanging from its hinges, but the black cat sitting calmly in the hallway, unharmed. Marlene and I had survived, but at a cost. Greg was gone. The barrier had held, but only just. I realized then that survival here wasn't about compassion or bravery. It was about sacrifice, about following the rules, even when it broke your heart. Dawn crept over Pine Hollow, painting the shelter in a pale, uncertain light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked almost normal. Almost. The kennels were quiet, the animals subdued, as if they too were waiting for some unspoken verdict.
I moved through the halls on autopilot, checking locks, refilling water bowls, and avoiding the empty space where Tasha's name had been erased from the staff roster. Marlene and I barely spoke that morning. She handled the paperwork, her face drawn and tired, while I tried to focus on the routines that had once seemed so simple. Feed, clean, count, repeat. But every task felt heavier now, as if the air itself was thick with memory and warning. I found myself glancing at the rules sheet more often, tracing the words with my finger, remembering every moment I'd been tempted to break them. The urge to help, the comfort, to act on compassion, those instincts had nearly gotten me killed. I understood now why the rules were so strict, why Marlene's eyes always seemed to carry a shadow of fear. The cost of survival here wasn't just caution, it was the slow erosion of trust in your own senses, your own heart. The animals watched me differently too. The black cat in Kennel 7 met my gaze with a slow blink, her tail flicking in silent approval, or maybe warning. The other animals seemed calmer, as if the balance had been restored, at least for now. But I knew better than to believe in peace. At Pine Hollow, normalcy was just a thin veneer stretched over something ancient and hungry. I thought about Tasha, about the others who had come before me. Their names were never spoken, their stories reduced to cautionary tales whispered in the staff room. I wondered if anyone outside the shelter would ever know what really happened here, or if the world would simply keep turning, oblivious to the battles fought in places like this. As the day wore on, the routines resumed. New animals arrived, paperwork was filed, and the shelter's uneasy rhythm returned. But I was different. I moved with a new wariness, a respect for the boundaries that kept us all alive. The rules were no longer just a list of odd instructions. They were a lifeline, a fragile barrier between order and chaos. That night, as I locked the staff room door and listened to the wind rising outside, I realized I would never see the world the same way again. The cost of survival at Pine Hollow was high, measured in fear, sacrifice, and the loss of innocence. But as long as I followed the rules, I had a chance. And for now, that would have to be enough. 2 weeks later, the shelter was running on a fragile sense of normalcy. The animals had settled, the staff moved with a quiet, haunted efficiency, and the memory of Tasha's disappearance was a shadow we all tried to ignore. I'd memorized every rule, every ritual, and every subtle sign of danger.
The file Marlene gave me never left my bag. On a gray Monday morning, a new volunteer arrived. Her name was Riley, fresh out of college, eager, and full of the same optimism I'd brought with me. She stepped out of her car with a duffel bag and a hopeful smile, waving at me as I finished cleaning the outdoor runs. "Hi, I'm Riley. I'm supposed to start today?" she said, her voice bright, her eyes scanning the kennels with curiosity. I forced a smile, remembering how I'd felt on my first day, how the shelter had seemed like a place of second chances, not a battleground. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Let's get you settled." As I led her through the shelter, I watched her take in the details, the covered mirrors, the salt lines, the way the animals watched her with silent, knowing eyes. She asked questions, laughed at the quirks, and didn't notice the tension in my shoulders. Finally, I brought her to the staff room and handed her a laminated sheet, the same one Marlene had given me. "Before you start, you need to read these, all of them, and you need to follow them, no matter what." Riley glanced at the list, her brow furrowing. "Is this some kind of initiation? These rules are weird." I met her gaze, my voice steady but heavy with experience. "They're not a joke. They're not a tradition. They're the only reason you'll make it through your first week. Don't question them. Don't break them. Not even once." She hesitated, then nodded, sensing the seriousness in my tone. "Okay, I promise." As I watched her read the rules, I felt a pang of guilt and hope. I wanted to warn her about everything, to tell her the truth about the shelter, but I knew she'd have to learn the hard way, just like I did. The cycle continued. I could only hope she'd survive it.
That night, as I finished my rounds, I paused outside Kennel 7. The black cat sat in the shadows, her golden eyes reflecting the dim light. She watched me with an intensity that felt almost human, patient, ancient, and impossibly knowing. I wondered, not for the first time, if she understood more about this place than any of us ever could. Riley's laughter drifted from the staff room, bright and unburdened. I envied her innocence, even as I feared for her. I remembered my own first night, the way I dismissed the rules as superstition. Now, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights set my nerves on edge. As I turned to leave, I noticed something new taped to the staff bulletin board, a fresh sheet of paper written in the same red ink as the original rules. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. 8. If you find a collar with no name, do not touch it. Leave it where it lies. I hadn't seen this rule before. Had it always been there, or had something changed? I glanced back at the cat, who blinked slowly, her tail curling around her paws. A cold wind rattled the windows, and somewhere outside an animal howled, a sound that was almost but not quite a dog. I shivered, feeling the weight of the shelter's secrets pressing in from all sides. The rules were growing, the barrier was changing, and I realized, with a chill, that the cycle would never truly end. If you ever find yourself at Pine Hollow, remember,
The animals have rules for the staff, and some rules are written in blood.